Have you ever stopped to realize that most of your suffering doesn't come from the world, but from what happens inside your mind? There's a voice in there, incessant, demanding, often cruel, that comments on everything you do. And strangely, you believe it. But what if I told you that voice isn't you? What if much of what you think is just conditioned noise, invisible inheritances, automatic projections? In this video, you'll discover why the self that thinks may be just an illusion. You'll understand how the mind became your prison, and why the silence you avoid might be your only way out. Let's explore together a rarely visited territory, the space between thought and consciousness. That intimate and deep dimension where you don't think about life. You witness it. Get ready to look within with courage. Not to judge yourself even more, but to detach from the inner traps you don't even realize you carry. Perhaps by the end of this video you'll discover one of the most liberating truths there is. You are not what you think. You are the one who observes what you think. 1. The voice in your head never shuts up. But where does it come from? Ever since you can remember, there's been a voice in your head narrating everything. It comments, compares, judges, anticipates. And the most curious thing, it didn't ask permission to begin. One day it just started talking. Thinking seems to be something spontaneous, but actually, it's a process you inherited. You learned to think, but you never had the chance to choose how, or whether you even wanted to think that way. It's like a radio that was born turned on with no off switch. That voice isn't neutral. It carries your parents' accent, your traumas, your schools, the movies you watched as a child. Every thought is like an invisible inheritance, passed from generation to generation. And even so, you believe it's you speaking. But is it? If you are what you think, then why do some thoughts scare you, bother you, hurt you? Who is the one who's bothered by what the mind itself produces? There's a difference between having thoughts and being the thoughts. The mind can be like an internal theater where you are both spectator and stage. When a thought arises like, I'm not good enough, maybe it doesn't speak the truth about you. Maybe it says more about what was programmed into you throughout your life. And that changes everything. Because if the thought isn't you, it can be questioned. Imagine for a moment that the mind is like a trained parrot. It repeats what it heard without understanding. The problem is you got used to thinking everything it says is wisdom. But maybe your true wisdom begins precisely when you stop listening to this parrot as a master and start listening to silence as your guide. 2. You keep reacting to thoughts that aren't even yours. Most of what you think on a daily basis didn't originate from you. They're echoes of what was said, what was expected of you, what you were taught to fear. Your mind functions like a replay machine. It repeats phrases it heard in childhood, criticisms you endured in adolescence, rules you learned to be accepted. And in the midst of this repetition, you keep reacting. As if every thought were a command. As if you were obligated to feel guilt over things that weren't even truly yours. Many thoughts are nothing more than old recordings, automatic programs triggered by invisible cues. You walk past a mirror and hear, you look awful. Someone criticizes you and your mind screams, you're a failure. But who put those lines there? Who taught you to treat yourself like that? Maybe it was an impatient adult, a figure of authority, or even the culture you grew up in. The mind learned this emotional vocabulary, and now repeats it without a filter. The cruelest part is that you end up blaming yourself for having these thoughts. As if your morals were weak, as if feeling fear, envy, anger, or doubt were a character flaw. But it's not. These thoughts don't ask for permission. They show up like spasms. And guilt only feeds the cycle, as if you were responsible for all the smoke the mind emits, even though you never lit the match. Understanding this is liberating. Because once you realize you're not the creator of everything you think, you can stop being a hostage to it. You can learn to observe the thought without absorbing it. You can let fear speak and not obey. You can hear the critical voice and not bow to it. After all, if the mind is a collection of old voices, you no longer need to obey them as if they were your truth. 3. Thought is not truth, it's conditioned noise. Most of the thoughts you have are automatic responses, noises conditioned by everything you've been through. The mind, in this sense, is more of a recorder than a creator. It repeats patterns, predictions, judgments, and learned reactions. You think because you got used to thinking that way, not because it represents an objective truth. The problem is that we confuse frequency with accuracy. Just because a thought appears all the time, we think it must be right. It's like living near a railroad. At first, the noise is jarring, but eventually it becomes background. Automatic thought works the same way. It's always there, buzzing with opinions about you, others, the world. But that doesn't mean it's right. It just means it was trained by fear, pain, repetition. The thought says, you're going to fail. But that's just a reflection of your past, not a prophecy about your future. And here is where the most revolutionary possibility begins. You can question the thought. You can look at it and ask, is this a fact? Or just my fear speaking again? That small pause between thinking and believing is where your freedom starts. It's like realizing you're not the puppet of the mind, you can be the observer of the theater. You can let the thought pass without following it as if it were your destiny. The consciousness that questions is more powerful than the mind that repeats. And the more you observe without identifying, the weaker the noise becomes. It doesn't disappear, but it loses command. Because you understand, not everything your mind says is true. Sometimes it's just noise. Noise from an old mind trying to protect you from what has already passed. And when you hear this noise clearly, it finally loses its power to control you. For when the mind becomes the enemy, the cycle of self-blame. There are days when your mind feels like an intimate enemy. It doesn't shout, it whispers. And those whispers hurt more than any outside criticism. You should have done better. You're not good enough. You're going to fail again. The inner voice becomes judge, prosecutor, and jailer. And the strangest thing? You believe every word. You don't even stop to ask, but who said that? And with what authority? It's a silent cycle. The thought appears, you absorb it as truth, feel guilt, try to fix yourself. And fail again because the pattern continues. This dynamic is addictive. The mind accuses and you defend. And in this internal war, no one wins. The problem was never the number of thoughts, but the blind belief you have in them. You believe in the mind too much. And forget that many times it doesn't want to help you. It wants to keep you trapped. This emotional prison feeds off your sensitivity. Deep people tend to overthink because they feel too much. And then they blame themselves for not being able to silence the mind. But look, overthinking isn't the villain. The villain is believing everything you think as if it were pure reality. It's forgetting that thought can be distorted, affected by trauma, by unfair comparisons, by distorted memories. Freeing yourself from this cycle begins when you stop treating the mind as an oracle and start treating it as a tool that may or may not be in tune. You can say no to a thought. You can disobey an inner accusation. You can laugh at an absurd demand. And in that act of silent rebellion, you begin to walk out of the cell your own mind built. 5. The illusion of the thinking self. For centuries, we've been taught to believe that thinking is what makes us human. I think, therefore I am, said Descartes. But what if he was wrong? Or at least incomplete? Existence doesn't boil down to thinking, and much less to that voice that judges, compares, condemns. There is something deeper, more silent, that observes all of this. And that something doesn't need to think to be real. It simply is. The mind judges, the ego comments, but there is a part of you that just observes. It's this silent observer that notices fear arise, sees anger grow, watches thoughts pass, without identifying with any of them. This consciousness is like the sky while thoughts are passing clouds. But when you identify with what you think, you forget the one who observes. You become a prisoner of mental content, not master of the experience. This confusion is common. You feel anger and say, I am an angry person. But the anger came, stayed, and passed. So who are you? The one who feels. Or the one who witnesses the feeling. There's a point inside you that never changes. Even when everything outside does. That point is where your freedom lives. Because it doesn't think. It witnesses. It doesn't judge, it contemplates. If the thinking self is an illusion, it's because it changes all the time. At one moment you think you're brilliant, the next you think you're a failure. At times you want everything, then you want to disappear. How can you trust something so volatile? True identity doesn't lie in the mind that comments, but in the presence that observes. And the more you connect with this inner silence, the more you realize, you are not the thinker. You are the one who perceives the thought and chooses what to do with it. 6. The invisible prison of inner monologue. Have you noticed how much your mind talks all the time? It's a continuous stream of words, expectations, analyses, justifications. As if life had to be narrated, explained, or controlled every second. And in this internal chatter, something essential is lost. The simple experience of being. You can't just be because you're always trying to understand, plan, or fix. The now becomes a battlefield between what is and what the mind thinks should be. This inner monologue creates a prison without walls. No one sees it from the outside, but inside it's suffocating. You wake up thinking, brush your teeth thinking, work thinking, sleep thinking. And it all happens on autopilot. The mind has become your habitat, and you've forgotten what it's like to live outside of it. It's like breathing recycled air, it keeps you alive but doesn't refresh you. Excessive thinking is exhausting, like an endless conversation with someone who doesn't know how to listen. The strangest part is that this someone talking inside your head isn't truly you. The deep self, the authentic self, doesn't need to justify or control everything. It's like a calm lake that doesn't ripple at every stone. It exists before words and beyond images. It expresses itself through silence, through presence, through that feeling of completeness that sometimes arises. When the mind, by some miracle, goes quiet for a moment, the mind shouts to prove its existence. The true self doesn't need to. It doesn't define itself, doesn't display itself, doesn't seek to convince. It simply is. When you start noticing how trapped you are in mental monologue, you can open the door of that prison and choose silence as a form of freedom. Not to reject the mind, but to remember it's just a tool, not your master. 7. The silence you avoid might be your liberation. We live surrounded by noise. Phones vibrating, notifications, music, videos, voices, and when all of that quiets down, what remains is the most terrifying presence of all, your own self. That's why so many people flee from silence. Because in it there are no distractions. And what surfaces there often are unresolved pains, postponed truths, fears the mind has swept under the rug. Silence is uncomfortable. Until it becomes sacred. Fleeing from silence is, deep down, fleeing from yourself. Because it's in the absence of stimuli that your truth begins to emerge. Without distractions, there's nowhere to hide. You truly hear yourself. You feel what you've been trying to avoid. And that's where the chance for healing lives. Because what is seen can be transformed. And what is forcibly silenced ends up becoming constant background noise in the mind. Peace is not the opposite of thought, it's freedom from it. When you approach silence, it's not that the thoughts disappear, but they lose the throne. They no longer rule over you. You begin to hear the spaces between one thought and another. And there, in that almost invisible gap, there exists a state of consciousness that doesn't judge, doesn't compare, doesn't demand. It simply welcomes. Silence, when accepted, becomes a portal. A portal to presence, to intuition, to self-knowledge. It's where you reconnect with what you had lost of yourself. That sense of being whole, even without understanding everything. Even without resolving anything. When thought loses its power to dominate, you discover that peace doesn't come from the outside, it was already within you. It just needed space to emerge. The mind lies and you believe it. The mind has the strange power to turn assumptions into emotional reality. You imagine rejection, and feel as if it already happened. You anticipate failure, and already carry the weight of defeat. Suffering begins even before life happens. Because thought doesn't just predict the worst, it stages it. And you, without realizing it, enter that play as if it were the only possible truth. The result? Anguish without cause, fear without an object, pain without a wound. The strange thing is that the mind lies with conviction. It speaks with the authority of one who knows, but it's just interpreting. It tells you, no one cares, you're going to fail, it'll always be this way. And you believe it. Not because you're naive, but because you were never taught to doubt your own mind. Believing it seems natural, and that's precisely where the danger lies. Because thought can be persuasive. And deeply distorted. These distortions build inner monsters. Thought creates catastrophic scenarios, repeats old narratives, resurrects fears you thought you had overcome. And you, unintentionally, feed them with attention, with belief, with identification. The more you believe the thought, the more real it seems. The more real it seems, the more you suffer. And this cycle repeats until you say, wait, this is just a thought. This small act of noticing, this is just a thought, changes everything. You don't need to fight it, nor pretend it's not there. You just need to see it for what it is, a hypothesis, not a fact. A suggestion from the mind, not a sentence over your life. When you stop feeding your inner monsters with belief, they shrink, lose strength, and sometimes disappear. 9. Consciousness doesn't need words. Some of the most significant moments of your life were silent. A genuine look, a vast landscape, the birth of someone, an unexpected hug. In those moments, thought doesn't lead, it lags behind. You're not explaining the experience, you're living it. And there, a powerful truth is revealed. Consciousness doesn't depend on words. It happens before any explanation. When you are present, thought quiets for a few moments. Not because it was forced to, but because it finally encountered something greater than itself, the direct experience of life. In that state, you're not judging the moment, nor trying to capture it in definitions. You simply are. And that's enough. It's as if the mind bows before the immensity of the now. The problem is that we're used to thinking about everything, even about what we feel. And in that process we trade presence for analysis. Instead of living the pain, we try to understand it. Instead of feeling the beauty, we try to document it. But life doesn't fit in words. It happens in the body, in the breath, in the instant. Thinking about something is different from being with something. And being is what connects us to what's real. This wordless consciousness is what the ancients called contemplation. A state in which you don't need to do anything but perceive. It doesn't solve problems, doesn't answer questions, but reveals a peace that can't be described. When you dive into that space, you understand, thinking is useful, but it's not everything. There's something deeper, and it can only be accessed in the silence of presence. 10. You are not what you think, you are the one who observes what you think. For much of your life, you confused yourself with your thoughts. When you thought something negative, you believed it defined who you were. When you felt shame, you thought you were weak. When you had doubts, you thought you were incapable. But that's just identification, the act of fusing with the mind's content. And that's the central mistake. Because what you think is not who you are. It's just a momentary expression of your psyche, not your identity. The true self has no voice, no opinion. It doesn't comment, compare, or justify. It simply observes. Is there, present, attentive, silent. It notices the thought arise, sees the emotion grow, senses the tension in the body. But doesn't get lost in any of it. It's like the sky watching clouds pass. It doesn't become the storm, it merely witnesses the movement of inner time. When you begin to disidentify from the mind, the landscape changes. Thoughts still come, but they stop being commands. Anxiety arises but doesn't dominate you. Anger appears but doesn't define you. You become free to choose what to follow, what to nourish, what to let pass. Because there is a broader consciousness that watches everything, and that consciousness is you. Not the content of the mind, but the space that holds everything. Finding that silent self isn't a mystical event. It's a return. A remembering of something that was always there, but was covered by 1,000 layers of mental noise. When you anchor yourself in that presence, you discover something rare. You don't need to control the mind. You just need not to be controlled by it. And then, yes, you find yourself not as an idea but as a living, lucid, and free presence. The mind speaks, but you are not the voice, you are the silence that listens. And that simple realization can change everything. Throughout this video, you journeyed through deep layers of consciousness, looked at the mind from the inside, understood its traps. And maybe you felt something new, a healthy distance between what you think and who you are. Now tell me, how many times have you suffered from thoughts that weren't even yours? In what moments of life did you lose yourself the most? Precisely because you believed too much in your own mind? Share in the comments. Your story might be the mirror someone else needed. If this made sense to you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here we don't look for ready-made answers, we learn to ask the right questions. Because sometimes all we need is a little less noise and a little more presence.